welcome back to Second Opinion. I'm Eli Stokols in Washington. In our episode tonight, slave labor on the high seas. The pandemic has affected all of us in so many ways. We know how it's impacted restaurants, professional sports, retail stores, businesses big and small. But one of the less explored impacts has been on the maritime industry. The virus creating one of the worst crises in decades, jeopardizing the welfare of millions of seafarers worldwide. For months, hundreds of thousands of workers aboard ships and fishing boats have been banned from stepping ashore because of COVID-19 restrictions. They've been stuck on ships and boats, forced to work without pay. But exploitation and abuse of mariners, it's nothing new, and few journalists know more about it than Ian Urbina. The Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative reporter has traveled across all 5 oceans and every continent, documenting human trafficking, corruption, and even murder on the high seas. Ian is our guest in this episode of Second Opinion, and he will join us in just a moment. But first, a closer look at his reporting on what he calls the Outlaw Oceans.
My name is Ian Urbina. I'm an investigative journalist. I'm the director of the Outlaw Ocean Project, which is a nonprofit news organization in Washington, D.C. Prior to being a journalist, I was a cultural anthropologist, and I had spent some time working on some ships, and I knew there was just great potential for narrative and investigation. The reporting started in 2014, and that began this journey, if you will, of a couple months at sea and a couple months back home, and I've been doing that ever since. When you think of the offshore realm from a work perspective, there's fishing and there's merchant marine. And so the merchant marine is all those ships that bring us 80% of what we consume, whether it's oil and grain or Adidas shoes and iPhones. The conditions of those workers are pretty different. They're often union, they're often contract, they're often from developing countries. And so while difficult line of work, it doesn't compare to the distant water fishing fleet, which is the other realm out there. And the distant water fishing realm is a brutal sort of Dickensian universe of labor, and many of those workers stay at sea sometimes for a year or two, working the entire time and not coming to shore. There are a bunch of things that have just been made worse by COVID. Ports imposed new security measures that limited the ability of crew to get off the ship and come on land. So that meant that seafarers were oftentimes working a 2-year contract and never coming to shore. I worked for 20 years at the New York Times and then decided I wanted to branch out on my own, and I wanted to stick with this line of reporting. I created a nonprofit small news organization, and I began trying to think of innovation in journalism, especially the distribution of it, new ways like music, to get journalism out to younger and bigger and more diverse global audiences. If we really want to get 17-year-olds, be they in Taipei or Caracas or New York or LA, to read these stories and start understanding what's happening, then maybe we need to go to where they're watering holes. And that's sort of almost like a gateway drug, if you will, or an on-ramp to get them from listening to music over to reading about what we want them to read. The impact of the journalism led to litigation against seafood companies that are complicit in human slavery. It's led to policy changes in terms of how ships are inspected when they get in port. It's led to several prosecutions of captains who engaged in murder. Environmental organizations that typically just focus on marine issues in the ocean space are now thinking about the human issues out there. And human rights and anti-trafficking organizations that typically think only on land are now thinking about those problems at sea. But generally speaking, I think the most important accomplishment, if you will, is that it's generally pushed out a sense of urgency and fluency among a lot of readers. And some of those readers are editors at other news outlets that are now more inclined to be covering the topic.
And Ian Urbina joins us now. Ian, thank you so much for sharing some of your work and taking the time to join us.
Thanks for having me.
So, throughout this pandemic, we've heard a lot about supply chain problems. We know what it's like to get our packages, maybe a little bit, it takes a little longer than normal. Your reporting is really helping shine a light on the people who are involved in these supply chains, this largely hidden workforce that spends months, sometimes years, on these boats and vessels under brutal conditions. Can you just start by telling us a little bit more about these laborers, who they are, and how some end up essentially enslaved on these ships.
Yeah, I mean, the distant water fishing fleet is a sort of uh, workforce that accounts for about 50 million people. Often these are migrant workers, often on ships that are flagged in developing nations. Often they're undocumented. And so, apart from just the nature, the sprawling nature of the oceans being sort of out of sight, out of mind already, the demographic of those who are on these vessels makes them even more invisible. And then, because the conditions are bad, because wage theft is common, the violence on these ships is very intense, quite often, so as to prevent mutiny. And so you hear, the UN did a investigation of distant water fishing fleet crews and found that 49% of them had witnessed murder.
Journalism is so much about going there, and there are so few journalists who have gone the places that you have, spending years investigating human trafficking on the high seas. Given everything you've witnessed, are there some images or moments that stick with you, may stick with you forever?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say there are two. One was in the efforts that we've had focused on sea slavery. The initial reporting took us to the South China Sea, so the body of water near Thailand, Laos, Myanmar, and we wanted to get on certain class of Thai ships that were notorious for using sea slaves, so trafficked, debt bonded, sometimes kidnapped, sometimes boys, not even full men. And it took a while. It took about 5 weeks to try to finagle our way out far enough from shore to get on these special types of ships. But the conditions were like nothing I'd ever witnessed. Roach and rat infested, 45 people on a 50-foot boat. They'd been offshore for a year and a half. All of them had been trafficked. All of them had debt bondage involved in their work situation. Two of them had reported beatings. One of them was missing his fingers. One of them had severe infection. So that was one case that really struck me as. And these guys were not planning on coming back to shore for quite some time. So it was unusually bleak.
Your reporting has revealed that some ship crews are stuck on vessels while others are abandoned on land, sometimes dumped on remote islands. Is this a systemic problem, would you say, within the industry? And how has the pandemic exacerbated it?
Yeah, I mean, so if you think of the fishing realm and the merchant marine as two separate realms, the most acute versions of violence and kidnapping and murder are often in the fishing, not the merchant. But the problem of abandonment of seafarer, the problem of abandonment of cargo, abandonment of ships is actually a problem that is quite acute also in the merchant marine. And the situation typically is where these workers are on a ship that is maybe at the end of its life. It's a pretty old ship. It doesn't have insurance. And for whatever reason, the ship operator, ship owner may run into some financial problems. They're sued, they're hit with environmental penalties, what have you, and they decide to cut their losses and walk away. And so overnight, they declare bankruptcy and just stop returning calls from the captain. And what that means is wherever that ship is around the world, maybe there are 40 guys on there, those folks have no fuel to get home. They don't have papers to disembark. They don't even have orders as to where they're supposed to go next. And they're really stuck. And on any given day, there are hundreds and hundreds of ships that are in this predicament. And it gets pretty dire. Some of these situations have led to, guys trying to jump overboard and swim to shore, drowning. Sometimes these cases unfold over the course of 2 years. They don't have fresh water, they don't have food, no way to call home. So it's pretty acute. And COVID has just put that problem on steroids. It's just sort of clogged the system, the maritime system globally. And so more and more ships are losing a lot of money. There are more bankruptcies. There are long lines at ports. And so just the brutality of this work has gotten much more intense.
Yeah, this is certainly a different facet of something we've talked about a lot on previous episodes of this program, which is just how COVID has exacerbated inequities here in the US. It's fascinating and really harrowing to think about the impact on the high seas for people all around the world. I'd like to read a portion of your recent editorial for the Los Angeles Times, which says, quote, human rights, labor, and environmental crimes occur often and with impunity because the oceans are vast. What laws exist are difficult to enforce. Arguably, the most important factor, though, is that the global public is woefully unaware of what happens offshore. Reporting about and from this realm is rare. As a result, landlubbers have little idea of how reliant they are on the sea or the more than 50 million people who work out there. There are major consequences to the ignorance of what's happening. We're talking about humanitarian and environmental crimes here. Your op ed reads a bit like an SOS, a warning. Please pay attention. Is that what you intended?
It is really. I mean, there have been a number of incidents recently that have brought this to light. You look at the explosion that occurred in Beirut and all the lives lost there. Again, a direct consequence of sort of abandonment of cargo and crew. You look at the delays we've seen in the port of LA and how that's had downstream consequences for consumers and costs. You look at the sort of logjam in the Suez. Mauritius and Mauritania both, last year had ships that tipped over and were spilling oil. So I do think generally the environmental and human rights and labor stories tend to only come to light when there are these acute crises. But and that's largely because journalism has gotten expensive and many institutions have pulled back from international journalism. And this type of journalism, reporting at sea, is distinctly expensive, difficult, and slow. And therefore, there's even less reporting than there was maybe 10 years ago.
Can you talk a little bit about the Outlaw Ocean Music Project? Why was that created? I imagine that has something to do with trying to reach people in a moment when we're all just inundated with news on so many platforms. It's hard to get people to click on something and to open it up and to sort of catch people. Is this an effort to do that?
Yeah, I mean, there are several ambitions in the music project. One is, my 17-year-old son won't read the New York Times or the New Yorker or the LA Times, the best journalism out there, and he's consuming his news. And he and many of his age peers are pulling their news from alternative sources, Comedy Central, YouTube, TikTok, Spotify, well informed often, but not getting them from the traditional watering holes, if you will. So one thought was, how can we bring this reporting out to where they are already, and sort of try to bridge build to where they're currently consuming information. And the second ambition is, how can we team up with creators, storytellers who use a different language, in this case, music, and tap into the people that already follow them and get those folks to read the journalism. And then thirdly, this reporting is distinctly expensive. So there's an entrepreneurial component to it, whereby the musicians who participate in the music project allow for 50% of any money made streaming revenue from the music to go into the nonprofit to produce more reporting. So essentially, it started as humble ambitions with 5, 6 musicians, be they hip hop, electronic, classical, what have you, and asking them, would you take sounds from the reporting that we've put in an archive? Would you make some music that's emotional and drawn from the reporting? And would you allow us to publish the album? And suddenly it grew to now 500 musicians from 80 countries and 90 million listeners, producing albums that's connected with the reporting. And we pair the albums and the music on Spotify and 200 other platforms with footage from the reporting. So it's been a really fascinating and fun and successful alternate way to grab at audiences.
Yeah, it's great that you're getting traction with it. I want to, before we let you go, I want to ask you, you've documented so many humanitarian environmental crimes within this industry, and yet there have been incredibly few prosecutions, not unlike some other areas in American life. But I wonder if you can talk a little bit about why you think that is, why so many of these crimes go unnoticed and unprosecuted.
I think there are two main factors. One is the geography of the space. It's so sprawling, 2/3 of the planet, and it's a geography that is huge and bifurcated. The high seas versus national waters. So the high seas or international waters belong to everyone and no one. They're very murky jurisdictionally. No single country has authority to do law enforcement out there, and so none do. And navies and coast guards have been defunded over the years, so there's very little presence out there. Point one. Point two: the demographics of the victims against whom the crimes are being committed are typically developing nation, migrant, and undocumented. And for that reason, also their lives are valued less. And therefore, when murder or kidnapping or whatever sort of wage theft occurs, those folks tend to have much less leverage socially, societally, to get law enforcement or governments to care and to do something about it.
Yeah, that's it's hard to hear that. It's a bleak picture you paint, but it's also a really fascinating discussion. I hope that it has helped make our audience more aware of it, because the crimes, the brutality occurring in far corners of the world's oceans, they would remain even more unnoticed if it weren't for your reporting. So thank you so much for joining us today. We really do appreciate it.
Thank you, Eli.
And to read all of Ian Urbina's editorial in the LA Times, you can head over to latimes.com/second opinion. And that's it for another edition of Second Opinion. Thank you very much for watching. I'm Eli Stokols in Washington. Until next time, goodbye.